Hi, Senna here. Unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably seen huge amounts of buzz on large language models like GPT-4 and their impact, potential or otherwise, on the legal sector. And yes, the potential there is huge, enormous. There's also a lot of buzz and a lot of marketing hype where maybe there shouldn't be. Without a doubt, GPT-4 is a mind-blowing advancement of artificial intelligence, but it's not synonymous with magic in the way that a lot of people are suggesting that it is. We actually did a whole webinar on this topic, summarized our findings in a recent blog post, and you can find that down below in the description of this video. So one of our favorite hobbies in the past couple of weeks has been to develop these applications for LLMs to the legal drafting process and seeing how they hold up in practice, kind of like throwing spaghetti against the wall and seeing if it sticks. And one such application that we recently looked into is fully automated markup. So basically you receive a contract from a counterparty and you want to make certain amendments. Well, instead of changing the wordings and the punctuation marks and just rewriting parts of the clauses, etc. yourself, you instruct the LLM to do it for you based on more general ideas of what you want to have happen, in the same way that a senior lawyer would instruct a junior lawyer to make certain changes to a draft document. Now, we're a legal drafting company. We don't do reviewing or markup in general. That said, we have gained a great deal of experience getting the most out of Microsoft Word since we've built our Microsoft Word plugin, ClauseBuddy. So this was an interesting experiment. It suited us well, and it doesn't really affect our core product offering. And that gives us a kind of neutral overview, gives us the ability to test these applications for real and see if they actually do hold up. You can start with a basic change. So if you read this definition of confidential information, you'll note that it applies only to information that is explicitly designated as confidential. And that leaves a lot of room for human error. So we're going to ask the tool to change the scope of the definition of confidential information so that it doesn't need to be marked confidential, but that it also suffices if it should reasonably be considered as confidential. And if we then look at the change here, you can see that GPT-4 pretty accurately nails this. It makes the necessary adjustment in track changes, and quite frankly, this is a very good approach, very reasonable approach to make that specific change. So that got us intrigued. Can it do these changes across an entire document? And one of the biggest overhauls you can do of an NDA, which is the document that we're looking at on the left-hand side, is to change the personal scope of application of the obligations. In our case, we're dealing with a mutual NDA. What if you ask GPT-4 to make the entire NDA unilateral in favor of Bank Limited? And while that's busy doing its thing, I'll just explain some more of the technical bits. So we're actually using the 32,000 tokens version of GPT-4 as offered by Microsoft. The normal GPT-4, which you can just get access to as a general consumer, limits itself at 8,000 tokens. And you can think of tokens as pieces of words, where 1,000 tokens is about 750 words, meaning this version can process 24,000 words. That sounds okay, but both the input document and any comments, modifications, as well as some hidden instructions that the software prepares need to fit in together into those 8,000 words. So in practice, you can review up to around 10 to 15 pages. Do note that it's just a matter of time before that limit gets improved. As a matter of fact, there's already a competitor of GPT-4 that offers up to 100,000 tokens, and at the time of writing, at least, and probably a week after this video airs, someone somewhere will have exceeded that limit as well, with the rate that this technology is evolving. So let's take a look at this newly turned unilateral NDA as offered to us by GPT-4. So it starts off by changing the title to unilateral NDA. That's not out of the ordinary. It's not necessary, but it's also not wrong per se. So that's fine already. But then strangely, it removes the counterparty from the introduction of the contract. That obviously doesn't make sense. There are still two contracting parties. The document just unilaterally favors Bank Limited in this case. In the recitals, it also references the counterparty again, where 3 lines above it had removed this party from the equation entirely. This probably has to do with GPT not understanding on a fundamental level how a unilateral NDA works. It gets a lot of things right, and as we'll see, it does that throughout the entire exercise basically, but it does seem to be confused about the legal technical term of a unilateral NDA. Taking a look at the definition list, we see another example of an interesting paradox where it gets incredibly close, but it clearly misses the mark. It understands that in a unilateral NDA in favor of Bank Limited, that this is the disclosing party. So it decides to change the defined term disclosing party to bank. So far, so good. But then in that very definition, reference is made to the receiving party. But then at the end of the definition list, that term is deleted because it is replaced by counterparty. Further in the document, you can also see that it still references disclosing party instead of Bank Limited. Again, it gets very close to the correct solution, but it falls just short. And also a much easier solution would have been to simply change the reference of the parties under the introduction clause to disclosing party and receiving party respectively. Then no changes would have needed to be made to the rest of the terminology in the document. Moving on to the next clause, you can see a few more instances where it does seem to understand the unilateral nature of the NDA, making it clear that it wants banks' information to be protected and placing the obligations on the counterparty, but it is sloppy on the terminology front again, choosing to replace or not replace certain terminology seemingly at random. And as we go through the rest of the document, we see more and more of the same. It seems to understand to a certain extent the legal nuance of a unilateral NDA. It does a great job of adjusting the language. It gets close, but due to some sloppiness, it doesn't quite get the cigar. And don't get me wrong, this is already mind-blowing. Like just being able to do this with GPT-4 pretty much off the shelf. The technology also still has a lot of room for growth, so expect this to work much better also in the coming months, maybe also with different attempts, because in fact GPT also always produces a different result even if you give it the same prompt. So it could be that if we try this a few times in a row that it yields a better solution, but as it stands though, it's not completely reliable on the very first try just yet. Whatever the case may be, it's still very much useful so long as a human stays in the loop. So, okay, let's increase the challenge a little bit. We'll ask GPT-4 to do some abstract legal analysis by asking it to identify the most problematic clauses. We'll hit review and we'll give it a second to conclude its review. No editing magic here for a second, mind you. That's another important thing to address. So GPT-4 is never going to give you the same answer twice. So I want to make it clear rather that I'm not asking it the same information 5 times and then cherry picking the best result. But also it can be quite slow, and it's important, I think, for what we're trying to achieve here, that we experience that in real time. But it does seem that we do have our output now, so it seems that we're starting off well. In the first comment, the definition for affiliate gets flagged, and it is indeed the case that this reference is outdated. The reference to the Belgian company code is no longer relevant. That legislation has already been replaced. That said, the reference to the specific parties doesn't have to be problematic necessarily. It seems, in fact, when you do take the effort to include specific affiliates by name, then you're probably doing that deliberately. Second comment implies that the definition of confidential information may be overly broad, could lead to disputes over what constitutes confidential information. But just looking at this definition myself, I would argue that the reverse is true. I mean, we're explicitly limiting the confidential information to only that information that is deliberately marked as such. And if instead we were to have said, all the confidential information is what could reasonably be considered confidential, then yes, in that case, there would be a lot of uncertainty. The scope would probably be too broad. But what we're doing here greatly diminishes the scope of what confidential information can be. That's also why we performed the broadening experiment in our first test. Again, it gets close, but it seems to lack some sort of fundamental comprehension of that sort of legal nuance there. In the next comment, it indicates that the obligations for the receiving party may be too strict. In my own view, this is pretty standard stuff, but it makes sense to at least flag it, since this is the real meat of the agreement, at least for the counterparty. This is where the most important elements are contained for that party. But yeah, moving on. Final comment is another good find. There is indeed no annex on inside information, even though an annex is referenced in the actual text of the document. This is the kind of thing you have to go through the document with a fine-tooth comb, rather. So very useful comment by GPT-4 there. Now, NDAs are super common, and the tool has actually been trained on a lot of that kind of material. So maybe that's not entirely fair. Instead, let's look at a software licensing agreement now. To review this document from the perspective of a customer purchasing software, and again, I'll ask it to first perform a general analysis, identify the most problematic clauses in the same way that we did for the NDA. And so the first comment that we receive is that there apparently isn't a definition for the term confidential information. And this is another one of those great examples of close but no cigar. It understands that capitalized terminology means defined terms. It even understands that these definitions for these terms are typically set out in a definition list. But it fails to see that just a few lines down into the paragraph, there is a term, confidential information, that's bolded, and that contains an inline definition inside of that paragraph itself. Next comment we receive, same thing. Worker is as a term is clearly defined in that paragraph, but GPT-4 fails to see it. Now, it should be said that the third comment is of the same nature as the first two, but here it is actually correct. There is indeed no definition for the term intellectual property rights, and actually in the next few comments we see that those comments being in the same vein, and we see that they are actually also correct. So we've got a couple of useful things in here, but we didn't get a sort of substantive legal and commercial review. We didn't really get problematic clauses from a potential legal or commercial position. So let's try the same exercise, but with a more detailed prompt. So if we provide a greater level of detail as to what the AI needs to look for, then naturally our results typically get better. That's the funny thing also about LLMs. They have all of this knowledge, but you sometimes need to coax it out of them a little bit by providing the exact right prompt. And so let's, instead of just asking very generally for the most problematic clauses, we're going to identify in which situations clauses are problematic by basically outlining our company policy almost, right? So we've got a liability cap that should be high enough. Again, I'm the customer, so if indeed if indeed there's liability on the part of the supplier, then I want that to not be too capped too much. Confidentiality obligations should not be mutual. Dispute resolution should be done via a specific arbitration mechanism, and there should be the notice period shouldn't be too lengthy. Basically, I'm asking GPT-4 to perform the necessary changes to make sure that we don't have any more problematic clauses then. And so if we scroll down the document, we see that 2 of the 4 changes were indeed made. The dispute resolution clause was adjusted as requested, and the liability cap was also implemented. Now, on the topic of the liability cap, one important important point to make here is that GPT-4 does miss a finer point of nuance. A little further into the clause, a little further from where the change is made, we read an important caveat that the total cap shall in aggregate not exceed a year of fees, basically. And there are a few more qualifying statements made below and a carve out for the customer's own obligations to pay the fees. And also I asked GPT-4 to see as problematic the clause that had a liability cap below 50,000 euros. Now, GPT-4 didn't ask, what are these annual fees? If these annual fees are 100,000 euros, then, there is no problematic clause there. But it probably should have asked what that amount was first before just making a random change. In short, there are layers to this clause essentially, and GPT-4 didn't quite untangle those layers, didn't quite see through that legal nuance in a way that a lawyer typically does. Now, for the remaining changes, well, we didn't get any changes actually. For the notice period for termination, that kind of makes sense. There actually is no clause in this document that sets out termination rights, so there's nothing for GPT-4 to latch onto. But that said, it probably should have flagged the absence of a termination clause then, especially since it includes a general comment at the top explaining that the notice period might be too long. Well, how long is it then? Because the document doesn't actually provide any information on that. For the confidentiality clause, we indicated that a clause was problematic if the obligations were mutual. Well, the obligations are indeed mutual, and it correctly flags that in the general comment, but it doesn't make the necessary changes. That said, I also didn't specify in whose favor that needed to happen, although, yeah, from our point of view, it's obvious that needs to be done from the point of view of the, or in favor of the client. So just identifying that clause is definitely in line with my instructions then. But you can clearly see that there's a difference between the way that it deals with the liability cap and the way that it deals with the confidentiality clause. And there's no apparent immediate reason why that difference is there. And finally, let's see if GPT-4 can solve one of the most difficult problems out there when it comes to altering a document on a grand scale like this, and that is anonymization. This may seem a little bit silly, but it's actually something that no company has solved before. No technology is out there currently that can 100% guarantee fully anonymize a document. Microsoft has gotten close with some of its proprietary technology, but there's really no solution out there that can do this for with 100% accuracy, which is typically something you would want when you're going through an anonymization exercise. And again, it starts off really well. It replaces the names of the parties with licensor and licensee, indicating a clear comprehension that of the type of document at hand. It realizes that it's looking at a license agreement, and that the parties in a license agreement are typically the licensor and the licensee. But it also gets sloppy. It doesn't replace Johnson, which means this document isn't anonymized. In the recital clause, it also nails a few key elements of this agreement, which should be anonymized, but also misses a few, like the name of the acquired company. The quality of the anonymization also kind of tapers off when you scroll down. It starts off really well in the introduction clause, minus a few errors, but then in the rest of the document, it just continues to reference Johnson throughout the entire document. And obviously that's not anonymization. In the signature clause, it also misses the names of the parties as well. So in conclusion, GPT is really good at language manipulation exercises, and we saw that in the language manipulation that we submitted to it. It knows how to find specific language. It knows how to adjust that specific language. It has an understanding of the language it plays with and knows how to make the necessary changes, but it also misses the mark quite a few times. It gets close, and then when it comes to performing nuanced work like logical, strategic, factual reasoning, that kind of stuff, it simply falls short. So right now, GPT-4 replacing lawyers in the context of a full legal review against things like company policy, statutory or jurisprudential requirements is still pretty much out of the question. The results simply aren't there. But the problem is that won't stop GPT from being confident in its response, faulty though that response may be. And at the most, it can be helpful to basically do your own review, then ask GPT-4 to come in, see if it can provide some additional suggestions. Of course, the danger is that people will start with GPT-4, assume that it knows everything, that basically, whatever is flagged by it are the elements that need to be reviewed, when in fact it may have missed quite a few things. But dealing with that challenge of how do you then apply GPT-4? Do you start with it? Do you augment it? Do you append it onto your own review? That is more of a process and organizational challenge to get everyone facing in the same direction than really a technological challenge. In short, though, we don't really think that this is quite ready for prime time yet. That said, we'd love to give you the opportunity to judge for yourself. If you want to give this tool a spin, let us know by signing up to the waitlist, and we'll activate this functionality for free on your ClauseBuddy account. In the meantime, I want to emphasize that it is going to be mere months, probably less than a year, before the technology is ready. And the key difference maker going forward is definitely going to be the kind of practical experience, expertise that isn't readily available in GPT-4's or GPT-5 or GPT-6 in the future, right? In its training data. I think like how to structure, the parameters of a license in a license agreement, like global or territorial, remunerated or unremunerated, the different kinds of ways that you can embed different legal nuances, like in a liability clause, for example, like having a normal cap, having carve-outs, having certain qualifying statements, super caps, that kind of stuff, and just generally, how to trade bargaining chips in the negotiation process. That is the kind of knowledge that experienced lawyers develop over the course of years when reviewing these kinds of documents, and it's expertise that is typically not available to an LLM because it exists in the heads of the lawyers. It's not something that it can just crawl the internet for. Most of this stuff is something that you pick up as you go throughout a lengthy career as a lawyer. Not everything like this can be put to paper, of course. That knowledge cannot just be collected in its entirety, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of unrealized potential there. It's even easier for in-house lawyers to collect this kind of knowledge because they typically have playbooks and company positions and standard clauses and fallback clauses and things like that, an idea of what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable in any negotiation process, and what that structure of that knowledge that you should be collecting at this stage, what that should look like, how you shape it, etc. That's something that we'll look at in a next installment, in a next post rather. But the bottom line is that now is the time to start collecting that knowledge in a structured database so that you're ready for when this technology is completely up to speed, and especially for law firms to kind of retain your competitive advantage over a tool that all of your clients will in the future have free access to.